Hello everybody and welcome to our presentation. My name is Ava Wheatley and presenting alongside me is Connor O'Brien. We are third year health and physical education students. Our topic is incorporating Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sports and games in the classroom. We would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional lands of the Lita Ramirina, Tairano Tapana and Paninaha people. We give our deepest respects to the original and continuing custodians of the land, sea and air of Lutruwita. We acknowledge all elders, past, present and emerging, from the Aboriginal ancestors who fought for this country, the Palawa people who continue to preserve it, and the future generations who paved the way on this sacred land. We would like to recognise the role that Indigenous people hold in protecting this land. We extend our respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are watching this presentation of ours today. Viewers are advised that the following presentation may contain images, names, location, and information that may cause distress. Viewers' discretion should be considered. Now, I want you to have a think about the Indigenous games that you may or may not have learnt in school, perhaps at a primary or secondary level, and whether or not you remember these well. Perhaps you don't even remember them. Did you learn about the culture behind the games you were playing? Have a think and we'll come back to this later in the presentation. The presentation will continue as followed. Connor will provide us with an overview of the topic as well as examples of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander sports and games. I will then inform you about how to incorporate this in a classroom and sporting context. And then our final thoughts will be shared at the end. I will now pass over to Connor for the overview.
Thank you, Ava. So now we're going to actually have a look at the topic. So I'm going to give you a brief overview of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander games and sports. I'm going to introduce, to begin with, we're going to look at the origins and history of Indigenous Australian games and sports. We're going to look at the different perceptions of Indigenous Australian games and sports. And we're also going to look at some examples of the types of games and sports that the Indigenous community played. So first of all, we're going to start with the history and perceptions of Indigenous sports and games. So pre-colonisation. It is believed from Edwards in 2008 that many of the games and sports that Indigenous Australians participated in before colonisation were based on their various cultural practices. The Indigenous people of Australia had many diverse groups who in fact spoke different languages and often had their own distinct cultural beliefs, practices and traditions. The traditional games that they participated in tended to be based on everyday life activities or as part of special ceremonial or ritual observances. These activities or rituals included skills such as hunting, dancing and singing, to just name a few. The children of the Indigenous communities best represented this through the use of their creativity and imagination to invent and perform their own songs, dances and forms of play. Play was generally influenced by the natural environment, knowledge of games and cultural constraints, which would include their gender or their designated roles within their community. This is evident by the natural resources that Indigenous people utilised to craft items to participate in games and sports, such as animal hides, tendons, twine and grass, to make bowls as an example. The types and amounts of games and sports that the various Indigenous communities participated in altered from group to group. As an example, for many of the hunter-gatherer and other types of societies, there were a relatively large amount of leisure time available for cultural practices which included those traditional games. In contrast, where food gathering for survival in a small family groups or other communities was required, there were fewer games and less time available for games to be played. Based on accounts available, there were a limited number of games in some cultural groups, while other groups had a much larger number of traditional games recorded. So now if you have a look to the image to our left, you will see an Indigenous community actually participating in some traditional games in the background. We can also now move on to our post-colonisation part. So once the Europeans arrived, Indigenous Australian games and sports changed significantly. The British discouraged Indigenous Australians from continuing their existing sporting traditions. Aboriginal people faced discrimination when participating in mainstream white Australian sports. So cricket, rugby, netball, soccer and field hockey were introduced into the Aboriginal communities as a way of encouraging socialisation with and assimilating Aboriginal people into the greater Australia culture. Cricket, in particular, was specifically used to teach Indigenous Australians white values. So, for a second, just imagine us Australians here today, we're playing cricket, we played Australian rules football, but all of a sudden we got invaded by people in America. They forced us to play basketball, American football, ice hockey, whatever it may be. Would that be the right thing to do? How would we feel? How would you feel? So that's probably a good question and probably something for you guys to think about. So continuing on now on this topic, modern sports, in contrast to most traditional games, are seen as a separate component of daily life and are often associated with high levels of competition and mass support, where victory and the pursuit of it may bring great rewards and failure, which can then lead to hostility and rejection. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have generally embraced the ideals and concepts of modern Australian sport, with a resultant loss to their traditional games, cultural heritage, or cultural expressions. Edwards' 2008 finishes with a quote: "Sport and physical activity has an important role in Australian society. However, the nature and role of traditional games within Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, both past and present, is often overlooked or is poorly understood. Australia needs to develop a pride and respect for its cultural heritage, or cultural expressions such as traditional games, both its present and ongoing manifestations, but also its cultural roots. A study of traditional games should be considered to be an important part of the cultural, social, and historical record of a country, and can then provide a means of investigating cultural change." So many of the games that we actually play today, so rugby, Australian rules football, and general play, have actually been adapted by many Indigenous games and sports that were once played. Do we feel like these have been left behind? In my opinion, I would say yes. In some cases, how do we think they've been adapted? So you think about Australian rules football, that's been adapted from the game of Mungrook, which was played within the Indigenous communities. And you also look at rugby, which has actually been adapted by one of the games we'll talk about very shortly. So now we're going to talk about some of the examples of traditional sports and games that the Indigenous communities once played. So they would include skipping games, bowl games, top spinning, dodging games, string games, tracking games, hide and seek, throwing games, wrestling, imitation, water, mock fighting, hitting, tag, running, and fire games. So there's a large variety of games that they once played. But to go for a few now, to begin with, there was Boronjin. This was a ball game played by the Cubby Cubby people of South Queensland. The game was played with a bowl made of kangaroo skin, which was called a Boronjin. The bowl, which was smaller than a soccer ball, was sewn with tendons and stuffed with grass. Teams from different groups played against each other, and the game was often played until sunset. Spectators used to mark their applause by calling "ee." The aim is for a player of one team to run as far as possible with the game and cross over a line at the other end of the field. He or she attempts to do this without being touched by an opponent, which is very similar to the game of rugby. Next, we've got Kintam, a keep-away game of catch ball, which was played everywhere by both genders in the northwest central districts of Queensland. Because the action of the players jumping up to catch the ball resembled the movements of a kangaroo, the Kalkadoon people sometimes described this game as the kangaroo play. The ball itself was made from possum, wallaby, or kangaroo hide tied up with twine. When this game is played in teams, the ball is thrown from one player to another player of the same team. The players of the opposing team attempt to intercept the ball while they are off the ground. Only a small jump is needed. The ball is only gained if it is caught while the defender is in the air. Lastly, we've got Pura. The Lake Air women made small gypsum balls to spin. The game was played by several players at once. The player whose ball spun the longest was the winner. Sometimes two women competed against each other, and in another form of the game, two balls were spun in a large bowl, which was the Pura, and there was quite excitement when the balls collided. So lastly, I want you to have a think of this question. What can we do as pre-service teachers and educators to highlight the importance of discussing this topic? So now I'm going to pass back over to Ava, who's going to go in a little bit deeper into this topic.
Okay, incorporation into a classroom. Knowing cultural needs is a highly developed skill that takes practice and knowledge. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders tend to avoid eye contact. This is often seen as rude as an adult, however, it is part of their culture. Due to their upbringing, they are also less likely to answer questions when being called upon, as they are predominantly used to sharing and telling stories that have been passed down by their ancestors, more so than questions and answers. It is important to relate examples to their environment and community because in Aboriginal worldviews, relatedness stems from the connectedness to living things, which is the primary foundation to Aboriginal tradition and culture. It is important to include community spirit in everything we do. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students function well when focusing and undergoing a collective achievement, more so than an individual one. It is a foreign concept for them to be tested as individuals, so avoid lack of participation or an outburst of some description. Understanding this is really important. English is a foreign language for many of them, however not all, so having resources, specialised programs and one-on-one time with teacher is important for them to progress in school at the same rate as other students. The Australian curriculum addresses the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history and cultures. It also recognises that there is a gap between Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, and although in the process of narrowing the gap in education differences, they state that working towards Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students being able to view themselves, their identities, and their cultures in a way which allows them to fully participate in the curriculum can assist in building their self-esteem. The Australian curriculum is designed in such a way that allows for all students to engage in respectful recognition of the Australian cultures. So, incorporation in a sporting concept. Sports such as cricket, rugby, netball and soccer have been introduced to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities in the past as a way of socialising with other members of the community. However, over the years, we as a society have isolated their cultural sports in order to put westernised sporting endeavours first, for example AFL, which is Australian rules football. This was a game originally called Marngrook and played primarily in southeastern Australia. Marngrook is a ball game between two teams with a possum-skinned ball. Each team competes to obtain the ball and move the ball amongst teammates to the end of the field and kick a goal. Ultimately, the team with the most goals kicked inside the flags or posts wins. Unlike a game of AFL, Marngrook was usually played over the course of 2 days rather than a few hours. The two teams were often referred to by totems, so black cockatoos versus white cockatoos, which enforced the connection between family and community. The AFL organisation originally denied the connection between the two, but have since stated that there is significant evidence that Indigenous football influenced this sport. So, why the lack of sports participation? Well, Indigenous athletes and their health outcomes are one of the primary reasons that sport participation is low within these communities. Indigenous populations are more likely to have poorer health outcomes compared to non-Indigenous, as the burden for disease is 2.3 times the rate of a non-Indigenous person. Chronic diseases such as respiratory, kidney, cardiovascular, diabetes and even mental illness compile 64% of total disease burden for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. With this in mind, it's understood that their health and likelihood to receive proper medical care is the primary reason participation levels are alarmingly low. After colonisation, the majority of Indigenous and Aboriginal games were abolished. In today's society, we deem it necessary to rebuild and establish the traditional games from the original owners of this land. Over the years, we have adapted these games due to safety and cultural reasons. Many sports, games and equipment that was once used is perhaps considered unsafe in today's day and age. For example, in schools we use tennis balls rather than spears and so on. Part of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture is to play as a team and not be competitive against one another. If a team member gets out, they immediately rejoin, or there is another task for them to do. In a health and physical education concept, this is called high time on task. Indigenous games play such a large part in a child's development for strength, balance, hand-eye coordination, accuracy, strategy, patience, and even intuition. This is because these skills were primarily used by the hunters and gatherers during pre-colonisation era to feed their families. Because of that, these skills were taught at a young age. Unlike many second-hand sources of pre-colonisation, there was a significant time for reinforcing these skills in their children, with time to grow their knowledge about their culture, with singing, dancing, storytelling, and so on. A game that would be played often is called Run and Scream. I don't know if you've heard this one before, but children would line up and take a deep breath of air. They would run as fast and as far as they can while screaming until their air ran out. They would then draw a line in the ground and repeat this process. Although it seems strange talking about it now, it's a brilliant game necessary for fitness, releasing stress, increasing lung capacity, that they use necessary to sing songs. It's critical that traditional games are played with children in schools to develop the same strategies. Circling back to the questions that were asked during the presentation, I want you to have a think about whether or not they were answered. Did you answer them as the information was presented to you? Did you already know the answers? Is this a topic that requires more information and perhaps it encouraged you to delve deeper on your own? We would love to know your thoughts. Thank you for watching, everyone. It has been a pleasure to share this information we have learned so far with you all. Thanks.